Welcome to Mr. Night Media.
Jake and Emily had always dreamed of owning a home together, and when they found a quaint old house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, it felt like fate. The house was a charming fixer-upper, with creaky wooden floors, narrow hallways, and a basement that held the kind of mystery they only read about in novels. They weren't concerned about the house's age. In fact, they were drawn to the idea of making it their own. The first few weeks passed without incident as they settled into their new life. They painted the walls, refurbished old furniture, and filled the space with laughter and love. But it was during one of these early renovations that they stumbled upon a strange discovery in the basement. Hidden behind a loose panel on the far wall was a small, square opening leading into a crawl space, just large enough for someone to fit through. The crawl space was unlit and damp, a draft carrying the scent of mold and stagnant air. The couple felt uneasy, but brushed it off as one of the quirks of living in an older home. "Maybe it's for pipes or old wiring," Emily suggested, not thinking much of it. Jake agreed, shrugging it off as unimportant, and they decided to leave it alone. But soon after, strange noises began to emerge from the basement. It was subtle at first, just a faint murmur or a distant echo. They both assumed it was the old house settling, but as the days passed, the sounds became more pronounced. It was the kind of low, persistent whispering that seemed to carry an intent, yet was impossible to decipher. Jake tried to reassure Emily that it was probably just the wind, or maybe some rodents moving around. One evening, the whispers intensified. It was past midnight, and Emily woke up to the faint sound of someone speaking. She nudged Jake awake, her heart racing. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Jake listened, and for a moment, he thought he was dreaming. The whispering seemed to carry up through the floorboards, drifting from below. It was an eerie, pleading sound, like someone trying to communicate but trapped on the other side of a barrier. They sat in silence, clutching each other, listening as the whispers ebbed and flowed, like a voice that couldn't quite break through to the living world. After that night, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The sounds continued to disturb them, each time a little louder, a little more desperate. One night, as Jake was coming back from work, he decided to go down into the basement alone. He grabbed a flashlight and moved towards the crawl space. As he approached, the whispering stopped, replaced by a faint scratching, almost like nails dragging against wood. He crouched by the opening, peering into the darkness, his flashlight barely illuminating the narrow space. The smell of mold was stronger now, thick and stale. Just as he was about to close the panel, he froze. His flashlight caught something, a pair of eyes staring back at him from deep within the crawl space. Jake stumbled back, his heart pounding, nearly dropping the flashlight. In his panic, he shined the light back into the crawl space, but there was nothing there. The eyes had vanished, leaving only darkness and an unsettling silence. Shaken, he closed the panel tightly and rushed upstairs to Emily, his face pale. "There was someone there, Emily. I swear I saw eyes," he managed, his voice shaky. Emily's eyes widened, a mix of fear and disbelief. Neither of them slept that night, haunted by the image of those staring eyes. The next day, they discussed sealing the crawl space. Jake didn't want to go near it again, and Emily was more than willing to help him block it off. They decided to fill the panel with cement, hoping that would finally put an end to the whispers. However, later that evening, Emily did a little research into the history of the house. She visited the local library and sifted through old newspapers. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon something disturbing. Nearly 50 years ago, a man named Thomas Carver had lived in their house. He was a quiet, reclusive figure, often seen around town, but rarely engaging with anyone. One night, he vanished without a trace, and though the townspeople suspected foul play, no body was ever found. Emily's heart sank as she read the article. The neighbors at the time believed that Thomas had gone mad, locking himself in the house and refusing to leave. Rumors spread that he had hidden himself away in the basement, becoming obsessed with a hidden gateway to the other side. Some locals even whispered that he had sealed himself inside the crawl space, hoping to communicate with spirits beyond the grave. She returned home, terrified, and shared her findings with Jake. They realized that the whispers they'd been hearing might belong to Thomas, who could have trapped himself in the crawl space all those years ago, hoping to find a way into the afterlife. That night, they couldn't help but feel an oppressive weight in the house, as if someone or something was aware of what they had uncovered. They heard faint tapping sounds, like nails dragging along the walls, and the whispering returned, louder and more frantic than before. It was no longer the gentle murmuring they'd heard initially. It was now filled with despair, begging for release. They spent the next few days living in a state of terror, unsure of what to do. Desperate, they finally decided to seal the crawl space for good. Jake went down to the basement, armed with concrete and tools. Emily stayed close by, watching nervously from the stairs. Just as he was about to pour the concrete, they heard the whispering again, this time right next to them. It was a guttural, pleading voice that seemed to come from both the walls and the air around them. A wave of cold washed over them, and for a brief moment they felt as if they were not alone in the basement. "Please don't leave," the voice seemed to murmur. Jake, with trembling hands, poured the concrete, ignoring the whispering that grew louder and more desperate with every passing second. When he finished, the basement fell silent. The voice was gone, and the crawl space was sealed. Relieved, they hoped that would be the end of it. For several weeks, there were no noises, no strange encounters, just a quiet, peaceful home. But one night, as they lay in bed, they heard a soft whisper coming from the floorboards once more. "Why did you leave me?" They never went into the basement again. The whispers continued, growing fainter with each passing month, as if Thomas's spirit was slowly fading. Eventually, they moved out of the house, unable to bear the lingering presence any longer. Years later, they heard the house had been abandoned, its walls still echoing with whispers from the crawl space, forever haunted by the spirit of the man who never found his way out. Sarah had just started her first year at a university in a city far from her hometown. She was excited about her new life and eager to experience the independence of living on her own. Housing in the city was expensive, but she found a reasonably priced basement apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was small but cozy, and she was grateful to have her own space. The apartment was furnished with just the basics: a small bed, a couch, a compact kitchen, and a bathroom. The lighting was dim, but Sarah liked the feeling of having her own little sanctuary to retreat to after long days of classes. She spent her first few days decorating, putting up posters, and arranging her books and personal items. Everything seemed perfect, except for one odd detail: a locked door in the corner of her kitchen. The door was old and wooden, with paint chipping around the edges. Sarah's curiosity was immediately piqued, and she wondered what lay behind it. When she asked her landlord about it, he brushed it off, explaining that it was just a storage closet that hadn't been used in years. He seemed uncomfortable discussing it, quickly changing the subject and refusing her request for a key. He mentioned that the door was warped and wouldn't open anymore due to age and disuse. At first, Sarah accepted his explanation, but as the weeks went by, her curiosity gnawed at her. The door became a sort of mystery, something she couldn't help but think about every time she entered the kitchen. She often imagined what could be behind it: old furniture, forgotten trinkets, maybe even a piece of history left behind by a previous tenant. Then came the noises. They started off as faint shuffling sounds that Sarah could only hear late at night when everything else was quiet. She chalked it up to her imagination, or perhaps noises from neighboring apartments. The walls were thin, after all, and sometimes she could hear the muffled voices of her neighbors through them. But soon, the noises became harder to ignore. Late at night, she would hear soft banging sounds coming from behind the door, as if something or someone was moving around on the other side. Sarah tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was just pipes or the building settling, but deep down, she felt uneasy. The locked door had started to feel like a presence, as though something unseen was waiting just behind it. She began avoiding the kitchen at night, feeling a chill run down her spine whenever she caught herself glancing at the door. One night, however, everything changed. Sarah had stayed up late studying for an upcoming exam. losing track of time as she pored over her textbooks. It was well past midnight when she finally decided to get a glass of water before bed. The apartment was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, pressing down on her. As she stood in the kitchen filling her glass, she heard it, a loud, unmistakable bang from the other side of the door. She froze, gripping the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. Another bang, louder this time, followed by a frantic scratching sound, like fingernails dragging down wood. It was as if someone were trying to claw their way out. Fear paralyzed her, but a sense of dread curiosity compelled her to take a step closer. She stared at the door, watching as the doorknob jiggled slightly, as if something was trying to turn it from the other side. Unable to bear it any longer, she ran to her phone and called her landlord. Her voice shook as she described what was happening, begging him to come over and help. After a few moments of hesitation, he agreed to come, but warned her not to open the door. Within half an hour, her landlord arrived, accompanied by a locksmith. Sarah could see the reluctance on his face, the way he avoided looking at the door as if it held memories he'd rather forget. The locksmith, a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard, examined the lock, muttering to himself as he worked. It seemed like it had been rusted and jammed for years, refusing to budge despite his best efforts. As they worked, Sarah noticed something odd. Her landlord looked increasingly agitated, casting anxious glances toward the door. She asked him if he knew anything about what was behind it, but he simply shook his head, murmuring that it was just an old closet. His avoidance only heightened her fear and curiosity. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lock gave way with a loud click, and the door slowly creaked open. Sarah held her breath, peering into the darkness beyond. The room was small, barely more than a closet, and completely empty. The walls were coated in dust, and a musty, stale odor wafted out, making her wrinkle her nose. But as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the walls, faint yet unmistakable, were scratch marks, long, jagged lines that ran from the floor up to the ceiling. Some were shallow, while others dug deep into the wood, as if someone had frantically tried to claw their way out. Near the floor, she spotted stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood, a rusty brown color that had seeped into the wood over time. Her landlord seemed to pale as he looked inside, his face twisted with a mix of fear and regret. Before she could question him, he stepped back, muttering that he had to leave, his face ashen. The locksmith, too, seemed disturbed, quickly gathering his tools and leaving without another word. Left alone in her apartment, Sarah felt a wave of nausea. She closed the door, feeling sick, and tried to tell herself that there had to be a logical explanation. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the image of those scratch marks and the stains on the wall. The next day, she decided to ask her neighbors if they knew anything about her apartment's history. Most were reluctant to speak, giving her vague answers, but eventually, one elderly woman took pity on her. She told Sarah about a young woman who had rented the apartment years ago. She had been quiet and kept to herself, rarely seen by the neighbors. One day, she simply vanished, leaving all her belongings behind. The police had investigated, but found no signs of foul play. Eventually, the case was closed, and she was declared missing, presumed dead. Rumors spread, of course. Some whispered that she had gone mad, locking herself away in the apartment, while others believed that something sinister had happened to her in that very basement. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she listened, the pieces of the story fitting together in her mind. The banging, the scratching, the locked door, it was as if the missing tenant was still there trying to escape. Terrified, Sarah decided she couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. She packed her belongings and moved out within a week, unable to endure the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to linger around the locked door. After she left, she heard that the apartment remained vacant. Some said they could still hear faint scratching sounds coming from behind the door, and a few claimed to have seen flickering lights in the basement at night, as though someone or something was still trapped inside, trying to escape. Years later, Sarah still couldn't shake the memories of that basement apartment. She would wake up some nights, hearing faint scratching sounds in her dreams, the image of those claw marks forever etched in her mind. The Sullivan family thought they had struck gold when they found the old Victorian house at the end of Maple Lane. It was big, beautiful, and almost within their budget. The house had been on the market for quite some time, which surprised them. Such a grand house in a quiet neighborhood would normally be snatched up in no time. When they toured the property, it was clear the house had its quirks. Creaky floors, narrow hallways, and a musty smell in the basement. But for the Sullivans, it was perfect. As they settled in, Mrs. Sullivan quickly discovered the most unusual part of their new home, the basement. Every wall of the basement was covered in floor-to-ceiling mirrors, reflecting each other endlessly. The effect was dizzying, creating an infinite series of reflections that made the small basement room feel like it stretched on forever. At first, they thought about taking the mirrors down, but their teenage daughter, Lily, insisted they keep them. She loved the surreal look, saying it gave the house character. So they decided to leave the mirrors as they were, albeit with a touch of unease. In the first few days, everything was normal. The family went about their routines, unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting acquainted with their new home. But soon, little things started to feel off. It began one evening when Mrs. Sullivan went downstairs to do laundry. As she loaded the washing machine, she caught a flicker of movement in the mirror out of the corner of her eye. Startled, she turned around, but there was nothing there. She brushed it off, thinking it must have been a trick of the light or her tired eyes. Over the next few days, she kept noticing odd things in the mirrors. She would see fleeting shadows, shapes that didn't belong, and once she swore she saw a dark figure standing behind her. But whenever she turned around, the room was empty. She kept her suspicions to herself, not wanting to scare the kids or seem paranoid to her husband. But soon, the rest of the family started experiencing things too. One night, as the family gathered in the living room, 10-year-old Tommy came running up from the basement, pale and visibly shaken. "Mom," he whispered, "there's someone down there." "Tommy, honey, what do you mean?" Mrs. Sullivan asked, trying to soothe him. "I saw him," Tommy insisted, pointing toward the basement door. "There was a man in the mirror. He was watching me, and he was smiling." Mr. Sullivan dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination, but Mrs. Sullivan felt a chill run down her spine. She too had seen strange things in those mirrors. But like any mother, she reassured Tommy that it was just a trick of the light, an illusion caused by the many reflections in the room. She even went down to the basement with him to show him that no one was there. As the days passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Lily, who initially loved the mirrors, started avoiding the basement altogether. She claimed that whenever she looked into them, her reflection seemed wrong. She described how her own face would stare back at her with a cold, unsettling grin when she wasn't smiling. Sometimes, her reflection would blink when she wasn't blinking, or turn its head slightly out of sync with her own movements. Mr. Rowe Sullivan was skeptical at first, but when he went down one evening and caught a glimpse of what looked like a shadow moving across the mirror behind him, he too began to feel a creeping sense of dread. Determined to solve the mystery, Mr. Sullivan finally decided they should take the mirrors down. They began the task on a Saturday afternoon, armed with hammers and crowbars. As they pried off the first mirror, a wave of damp, cold air hit them, as if the wall itself had been holding its breath. Behind the mirror, they found something that made their skin crawl. Deep scratch marks gouged into the wood and plaster, as though someone had been trapped behind the mirror, desperately trying to claw their way out. What is this?" Mrs. Sullivan whispered, backing away. Each mirror they removed revealed more scratch marks, some fresh and others faded with time. The walls were scarred, covered in dark, rusty stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. And in some places, they found tiny half-finished carvings, almost like words, but the letters were too worn and faded to read clearly. As they continued to take down the mirrors, strange noises began to echo through the basement. Soft, shuffling sounds, almost like whispering, and occasional thumps, as if someone was moving just out of sight. The air grew heavier, colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the room. By the time they finished removing all the mirrors, it was nearly midnight. The basement walls were now bare, exposing the scratches, the strange symbols, and the marks left by whoever or whatever had once been trapped in that room. As they stood there, exhausted and horrified, Mrs. Sullivan noticed something strange. One of the mirrors they had removed was leaning against the wall, reflecting the entire room. But instead of seeing their own reflections, they saw a crowd of shadowy figures standing silently, staring back at them from the mirror. The figures were vague, their forms barely distinguishable, but their eyes, dark, empty pits, were locked onto the family, following their every movement. Slowly, one of the figures raised a hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a dark, smudged mark. And then, as if on cue, all the figures began to press their hands against the inside of the mirror, clawing at it, trying to break free. Panicking, Mr. Sullivan grabbed the mirror, intending to shatter it, but just as he lifted it, a voice echoed through the basement. A faint, whispery sound, barely more than a breath. "Let us out." He dropped the mirror in shock, and it shattered on the ground, the pieces scattering across the floor. But the figures didn't disappear. Instead, each fragment of glass seemed to capture one of the shadowy figures, trapping them in countless tiny reflections scattered across the basement floor. The shadows seemed to writhe within the shards, pressing against the glass, trying to escape even from the fragments. Desperate to end the nightmare, the family left the basement and locked the door behind them. That night, they slept with the lights on, haunted by the images they had seen. The next morning, they packed up and left the house, unwilling to spend another night under its roof. The Sullivans never returned to the house on Maple Lane. The property remained vacant, the basement door firmly locked. Neighbors would sometimes report seeing strange lights flickering in the basement windows late at night, and some claimed they could hear soft whispers drifting out from behind the locked door. Over time, the story of the house faded into urban legend. People spoke of the basement of mirrors, a place where shadows lingered, trapped behind glass, waiting for the next family to move in and release them. No one dared to remove the last of the mirrors.